Welcome to this second webinar of the Global Labor University online course, Post-Corona Starts Now. My name is Frank Hoffer, and together with Adlira Jaffel, our director of the Global Labor University Online Academy, we will moderate this discussion. Please, we want to make this discussion as participatory as possible, and we would ask you to make full use of the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to put questions to our panelists. At the end of the session, we will also send you a short questionnaire trying to get your feedback. The theme of this webinar is income security, protecting people, and saving economies. And I'm really extremely glad to welcome two global specialists on this topic. One is Mirai Chatterjee from India. Mirai is the chairperson of the Seva Cooperative Federation and also the chairperson of the International Board of Viego, Women, Informal Economy, Globalizing and Organizing. Welcome, Mirai. And Patrick Belser. Patrick is a senior economist at the ILO and the principal author of the ILO's flagship report, the Global Wage Report. And maybe I start our discussion with a question to you, Mirai. In India, 90% of the workers are in the informal economy. How did your members survive during the lockdown, and how are they surviving now, where the lockdown has been lifted, but the infections seem to increase in India?
Thank you very much, Frank, and delighted to be here with you and other colleagues. Well, I must say the first lockdown, we've had 4 lockdowns. The first lockdown was a huge shock. No one was prepared, least of all informal workers, who are, as you said, more than 93% of the workforce in India. And if we speak of the women's workforce, more than 94% are informal workers. So the first thing was that what little work they could pull together, some of them who were purely self-employed, like street vendors, like artisans, in the first lockdown, they somehow managed to keep some of their livelihood going. But as the lockdowns got stricter and stricter, people just completely lost work. In fact, livelihoods of informal workers, self-employed migrant workers have been devastated. And the estimates are that upwards of 200 million informal workers have lost their livelihoods. It's a huge and very, very serious and dire concern for all of us in India. How they survived? Well, as I said, whatever little work they could get, what little livelihood they could get, they borrowed, they used up their savings. Whatever food they had was finished within the first week. And it was left up to civil society organizations like mine, Seva, to feed them as best as we could. Of course, we are not our government. And then later on, the government announced free food, free rations, wheat and rice. But what about other essentials like spices, like oil, and so on? And that's where civil society and unions like ours, Seva, stepped in. Frankly, they started walking home. Many of you would have seen the very distressing visuals of informal workers, migrant workers walking up to 3,000 kilometers back home to be with their families. There was no transport, and only much later, at the end of the 3rd lockdown, the government organized buses and special trains and so on to take people home. There have been, of course, some relief packages announced by our government, but frankly, not enough. There were some cash transfers like 500 rupees, which is what, not even 10 US dollars per family for 3 months, 500, 500, 500, but clearly not enough. So we are facing now a huge humanitarian crisis, a crisis of livelihoods from which it's going to take us years, we estimate, to emerge. What are they doing now? Well, frankly, some of the informal workers are begging for work. It was heartbreaking for me. The other day, a domestic worker came to my door. She said she was willing to do any work 12 hours for any pay. This is the kind of situation that is now we see in our urban and rural areas. But on the positive side, there has been opening up of some industries like construction. This is now the sowing season, pre-monsoon, so farmers are busy if they can afford the seeds and inputs. They've been borrowing from money lenders and others for that. Organizations like ours have been trying to give them credit at better rates. The government has also increased the outlays for the employment guarantee program we have called the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee. So rural people are getting more work, but not for urban informal. So many unions like ours have been demanding that. As I said, the sowing season is on, so there's some work available there, livelihood. Food grains are now more widely available than earlier, but still wheat and rice and a little bit of lentils. So other staples are still missing from the package. The central government, that's our federal government, and the state governments have now put into place a whole lot of relief measures, but they're uneven. And of course, many a time informal workers don't know about these. So that's where the role of civil society unions and cooperatives like ours come in. And civil society like Seva, we have been trying to give our members work. We've been trying to adapt. Artisan cooperatives are now sewing masks and so on. So there are some of those. But of course, we are not government. We step in and we play a bridging role. But I think finally the big worry is now healthcare. In the beginning, our infection and case rate was low. We are now up to 400,000 cases and about 12,000 deaths. And it is a very, very worrying situation, a triple sort of crisis of the pandemic, livelihoods, and huge humanitarian crisis. So I'm afraid the news is not cheerful from our part of the world.
Thank you so much for these insights. Can I just add up with one follow-up question? If you would say, look, what are the policy priorities which you think need to be drawn from a government side, but also from civil society from this crisis, not just responding to the crisis immediately, but maybe making the society as a whole more robust and resilient to these type of shocks?
Absolutely, Frank, and thank you for the question. Very important. I'd like to break it up into two parts. What we need to do now, immediately, without delay, and what we need to do more long term. I'll start with the government level first. The first and foremost is cash transfers. All of us unions have been demanding of our government that immediately cash transfers of roughly $100 to $150 per household are provided to informal workers and their families, and organizations like ours which have organized them, and cooperatives, and there are many, and NGOs, civil society is active fortunately in India. We can help identify them and help them with the whole process of banking and financial inclusion to get the cash transfer. Second, fortunately, we have in place for some categories of informal workers, like construction workers, worker welfare funds. These are funds accumulated from a cess, which is levied on the industry. And typically they just, I'm sorry to say, accumulate and are not reaching the workers. So one of the demands has been to open up these funds quickly and reach them to workers like construction workers. And that has been done to some extent, I'm happy to say. We've also been asking our government to cover fixed costs for nano and tiny enterprises, the kind of women's cooperatives that my own organization runs, those run by self-help groups, small collective enterprises, which will, actually these are survival enterprises, we call them, which will go under unless government provides some wage subsidy or fixed cost subsidy. Third, working capital and soft loans for informal workers to rebuild their businesses and reboot. Extending the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee scheme further and to urban informal workers, as I mentioned earlier. enable more digital marketing of products. You know, after agriculture, handicrafts is a huge employer of informal workers. So extending digital marketing facilities and buying their products. Government is a big buyer, purchaser, buying their products preferentially on priority. And importantly, setting up a livelihood restoration fund at the national level, which then should be decentralized to the states and then further decentralized to the districts, so that tiny, small enterprises of informal workers can be supported. The other things that we have been suggesting is that, you know, just working on the livelihood front, though critical, it's not enough, because we have to take a holistic approach. This is, after all, a public health crisis. So we have been saying more investment in primary health care and steadily upping the investment, increasing the investment towards our goal of universal health care, which is, by the way, national health policy. So why not move faster on that? Similarly, universal social protection. Most informal workers don't even have the basics of insurance, even a minimum of insurance to fall back on, and have felt the lack sorely at this time of pandemic and crisis. So these are some of the things we have been saying to our government, and what we as unions, cooperative civil society can do: work with government and the private sector in partnership to, first of all, identify informal workers. A long-standing demand way before the pandemic was identity cards for informal workers, so that we have a name and a face. And we have seen that because we didn't have identity cards, because government didn't have any registration of the huge numbers, millions and millions of workers, it was very difficult to get relief and help out to them. So now let's make a beginning. So we help government, the Labor Department, provide these identity cards, which are portable, which means that any citizen of India can use them in any state, and they will help them get access to various welfare benefits. I think we need to organize harder and stronger and bring more and more informal workers into collectives like unions, cooperatives, and other forms of workers' organizations which are democratic, which are owned and run by them, so that we can quickly move towards livelihood restoration. I already mentioned that it's very important for civil society to be right there, standing with the workers and facilitating linkages between local government authorities and the workers for relief packages and for more long-term livelihood restoration, ensuring that the food reaches, the free food reaches, and so on. And particularly that women get work and livelihoods. A very disturbing trend is that as more and more migrant male workers return to their families in rural areas, women are being pushed out of the workforce and out of work because they are taking their livelihood. And we don't want to get into sort of unnecessary competition here, but there should be enough livelihood generated for all. And we have suggested a task force be created to look into skilling, because a lot of the people who went back to their rural areas were skilled folks. They were electricians, they were plumbers, there were a whole host of people who provide their services. How can they be, their skills and their energies be garnered so that we can rebuild our economy and our society? And finally, helping government raise working capital, including from the private sector, and advocating for the livelihood restoration fund. I think without a strong push from civil society, trade unions, cooperatives, and others, it won't come to pass. And similarly, universal healthcare and universal social protection. So I think it's this partnership, it's this joint collective effort that will be needed, because we are a large country, we are a diverse country with very, very different needs. One size definitely doesn't fit all. So it will necessarily have to be a decentralized local approach, the kind of approach that Mahatma Gandhi advised us more than 70 years ago. But now we're coming back to that, building bottom up from local, slowly, and leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirai, for that comprehensive picture about the situation in India. Patrick, we have seen around the world that, you know, people were talking, we have new heroes in the industry, the women and the men in the retail sector, in the health sector, in other essential services. But can you explain to us, why are all these people who prove to be now so essential often so poorly paid? Why is the market so unfair in paying people who save us in this crisis so little?
Well, thank you very much, Frank. Thank you very much for inviting me to this GLU session, first of all. I've been there before, you know, you've invited me, I think 10 years ago. It's always been a great pleasure. And it's nice to see that the adventure continues, even though it's now virtual, and it's becoming a bit difficult to see the participants and the students, but nonetheless, you know, congratulations first of all for getting this program continuing and going. It's been a fantastic product over the years, and really wanted to put this on the record for a start. It's also great to see Elvira, by the way, who's been working with us in the ILO for some time, some years back. And so I have actually registered in the program and learned a lot of things already, and really like the format also to where we see that 5 to 6 or 7 minutes videos who are very informative. There's not too much information. It's really a good way to learn and to enjoy the learning. So this being said, I'd love to have a good response to your questions, because initial question, because I think many people are wondering why this is that we're now there clapping these heroes and then looking at the paycheck of some of these heroes and seeing how little some of these people are being paid. And you asking the good question is, you know, why is the market undervaluing to some extent the work that these people are doing? And certainly, I would say, you know, the market doesn't really have a moral, and it fails to value the social contribution that people are making in some of these jobs. And we see that if first of all, if we rely exclusively on market forces of supply and demand, we can end up with very low wages for some of these people, especially those people who have very little bargaining power and who may not be protected by institutions like collective bargaining. They might not be represented by a union. And so the private sector will have this tendency of pushing down and wages and conditions and trying to get the people as cheaply as they possibly can. And so I think we need policy responses to counteract these some of these forces. Now, I would say things are quite complex, because certainly there is a strong gender dimension to the low pay of many of these workers in the essential services. 70% of workers in the health sector are women. Many of the workers in the care economy are women. And we know that women work tend to be undervalued in many countries, in most countries, in all of them actually. We've done a global wage report on gender pay gaps. That was 2 years ago it came out. And we documented that across the world there is a 20% pay gap between men and women on average. In some places it's much higher. In some industries it's much higher. And that most of this pay difference can't be explained by differences in education and skills and marginal productivity theories that we hear around. And most of these, a large share of this difference is due to either discrimination, the lack of equal pay for work of equal value, and this is also something that we demonstrated in this report, the fact that some occupations, or that the occupations that are female dominated tend to have lower wages than other occupations. And we even looked at enterprise level, and we saw that in the enterprises which are highly feminized, wages tend to be lower than otherwise similar enterprises. So it's not a question of skills, or it's not a question of market, it's a question of undervaluation. Then I would like to say also briefly, because I know we want to get a discussion going here, that we need to distinguish perhaps the private sector and the public sector. The bigger question perhaps, or the bigger surprise might be, why are these essential staff in the public hospitals and public enterprises so poorly paid? Why do they have so miserable contracts? And here I would say, let's not talk about the markets or neoliberalism. Let's face the fact that this is based on mistakes that governments have done, that public sector institutions have made, and the market is not responsible for the public pay scales in public hospitals. Of course, there are pressures. Of course, we know that there are fiscal pressures, but I think it's also a matter to have a new look in public institutions at some of these public pay scales, and I think we need to reassess these pay scales by taking into account the social value of some of these jobs. So I'll stop there.
Well, maybe I can have one follow-up question, and then we open up to the participants. And as you were at the ILO, and the ILO gives policy advice to governments, what would you suggest if a government comes to you and say, look, Patrick, we have seen this problem, we want to change it. What are the policy measures you would recommend a government could undertake to address the issue of poorly paid essential workers?
Okay, I think there are various policy instruments that can be used. For a start, as I said, with regard to public sector pay scales, I would say let's audit these pay scales. Let's rethink some of these pay scales. Let's have also a gender component to these audits. And I think a lot of the public institutions need to reassess these wage systems that they've been operating sometimes for many years. So I would say, let's work together and let's look at the gender dimensions of these pay scales, but also at reevaluating the value of some of these jobs, and making sure that those people who deliver essential services are being fairly rewarded, and that they're not being exploited, and that their mental and physical health are not being put into danger by these public pay scales. Secondly, I would say promote better conditions in the private sector. So we'll have the public side of things and the private side of things. And here, of course, one of the policy instruments that we are working on a lot in the ILO are minimum wages. We have now a new mandate, a stronger mandate that the member states have given us in the ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work to promote adequate minimum wages. They can be either statutory or negotiated. Adequate minimum wages means minimum wages that meet the needs of the workers and that allow them to support a family and have a decent living standards. So we are working with a lot of countries on looking at these minimum wages. And then I would say also encourage, promote collective bargaining. Don't see collective bargaining and unions as enemies. Work with them. Let's try and make sure that these people who are in vulnerable situations come within the umbrella of the organizations that that can promote better working conditions for them. Then maybe, you know, one more element to mention here is that, of course, one thing that weakens the bargaining power of the workers is the temporary employment contracts, is non-standard forms of employment. You're not going to go and see your boss and ask for a higher wage if you know you can be separated in 3 months and then again in 6 months. So I would say also, let's try and promote standard employment relationships, stable employment relationships wherever that's possible.
Thank you very much, and I want to hand over to Adlira, who has been following the Q&As from the participants. And Adlira, maybe you can then, after monitoring them, give some questions to our panelists.
Thanks very much, Bert, and thanks a lot to Mirai and Patrick for the very interesting insights. We do have a question, actually a couple of questions coming, particularly about workers' rights during the pandemic. And one is from India, actually, saying that we're seeing really that during this time, the government of the pandemics, the employers are using the pressure to actually lower the wages, for instance, and the same question comes also from Victor. So I suppose both of you could answer because it's not specific, but if you could say a few words about it.
I think one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire crisis was that several state governments issued ordinances to change the labor laws, basically to force workers to work long hours. If they want work, then you have to work long hours, you have to stay on the premises, all kinds of rolling back of basic workers' rights and legislation. And national unions like mine, the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEVA, joined with other national unions, and we had organized strikes. We have been going among the workers and explaining the situation as well. The unions have also gone to the courts and are challenging the constitutionality of this in the Supreme Court as well, under the Constitution of India. And unions have also complained and put in a complaint to the International Labour Organization. And I read that the ILO has also approached the Indian government about this, saying how it contravenes several conventions that we are signatory to. So I think that action at that level is being taken. The problem is right now is that there simply isn't any work. The economy just ground to a halt as we had one of the severest lockdowns in the world. So just even to open up the economy so that work starts and then we can begin the bargaining and the collective bargaining is going to take some time. Having said that, I should also add that these labor laws don't really affect the mass of the Indian workforce, which are informal, and the largest chunk are self-employed. So there's no employer-employee relationship. However, as part of the Indian labor movement, we stand firmly with our sisters and brothers to oppose these kinds of draconian changes in labor laws.
Yes, what can I add here? I think maybe on a more general point is that it is true that periods of crisis, of recessions, or of high levels of unemployment or of job losses are always moments where some of the progress that has been made over the years risks to be rolled back. And I think we've seen that in previous crises as well. We have to be very vigilant, I think, to keep monitoring the things that we at the ILO are supposed to monitor, which are fundamental principles and rights at work, the ratified conventions by the countries, and we have to keep documenting evolutions, positive and negative, in different countries. and we have to keep pushing for progress. And I think a lot of the discussion at this moment is about what is the post-corona world going to look like. And I think there's both hope and there is worries. And on the side of the worries, of course, as you mentioned, there's this issue of rights having been rolled back in some instances. But there's also, I think, strong hope that the world has seen how important social protection measures are. We have all seen how many people lack this social protection. I think 40% of people in the world don't have access to health services or health insurance. We've seen also that governments have been capable of putting in place some programs very quickly and in some instances quite effectively. And I think there is also hope here that some of these temporary measures can serve as an inspiration for becoming more permanent in the future. Of course, there will be a fight, a post-lockdown policy debate, and some people are going to push back for austerity again. And you know, we've seen this also in the 2008 global economic and financial crisis. For a moment, we thought, oh, we're all Keynesian now, and then somehow in the space of 6 months, nobody was talking about Keynes anymore. And here is, you know, yet again, here we are a few years later with another crisis, and I think an opportunity to learn from the lessons of the mismanagement of some of these past crises and recoveries.
Another question to Mirai, and it's basically about the issue of, actually two questions about the cash transfers and the fact that the universal basic income has come now up in different discussions. So there is a question from Melissa asking that you have actually accompanied the proposals and your demands also with proposals on where to find the funds or the sources for such cash transfers. So could you just elaborate a bit further on that?
First of all, I think in India, even before the pandemic, there was a healthy debate on universal basic income, and the stress is on universal and on unconditional, because we do have cash transfer programs, but they divide the workforce into above poverty line, below poverty line, which organizations like ours think, you know, are opposed to. So workers welcome this, but of course not at the cost of certain welfare programs. So the way it's being posited is, if you want this universal basic income, we're going to have to cut back on the food programs and certain other of the relief and welfare programs. So we think that's a false divide, and that's not the way to go. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that organizations like mine have been in discussion with some industrialists and corporate leaders and philanthropists in our country. And there is interest in this whole idea of basic income or cash transfers. And those who we have spoken to say that they would even be willing to contribute to a sort of larger fund. Of course, it should be tax deductible and it should be made attractive to industry as well, but they would be willing to contribute. Many of them have contributed millions and millions of dollars into a new fund, which is called Prime Minister Cares Fund. Again, has been rather controversial because it's under the sole control of, well, one entity, the Prime Minister's office. And there's been a call from several states that this fund should be decentralized and kept with the states, because we have a federal system. And those monies then can also be used easily for cash transfers, focusing perhaps on the most vulnerable first, and then quickly extending it to other sections of the population.
A question to you, Patrick. Actually, I think the discussion about wages for particularly the low-wage workers seems to be drawing the interest of many of the participants. So one of them is asking whether, besides gender, what are other, let's say, attributes that have influenced low wages for these workers, such as race or ethnicity. Another question related to that, somebody from Africa is speaking about the IMF loans and the conditions that they have put in the public sector to the budget ceilings, which have actually put pressure on the wages. And then again, on the frontline workers, there is a question whether it is possible to force the government in any ways to hit the call for frontline workers to raise their wages and allowances. And then again, on the frontline workers, and related to the discussion on wages, whether to look at the issue of income security and job security and how this kind of tie up together, and that we should not have them separated. So I'm putting all this together for you to kind of perhaps give a proper answer to all the questions.
Yes, look, on the first question, absolutely, it's not just the gender dimension. Of course, there are many intersectionalities, I think is the word that, that academics use, which make people more vulnerable to low pay and to discrimination or exploitation. So it's not just gender, it's also, it's very often the combination between gender, ethnicity, and race, depending on the countries. And because of course, you know, there are women who are highly paid and who are successful managers, and so it's not just gender, it's a combination of things. And of course, these issues of discrimination and inequalities are coming to the fore very strongly now, also with what's going on in the US. This question of pay gaps between different races, or depending how, or pay gaps between indigenous peoples and others in some countries in Latin America. These are all factors of vulnerabilities that add up to some extent, and so it's clearly something that needs to be looked at in a broader perspective than just the gender perspective. But I think still that the striking fact that 70% of the workers in the health sectors are women, and probably an even higher proportion in the care economy, I think gives this really a very strong gender dimension to the low pay. Now, can we force governments to do something about? That's that's a difficult one, in the sense that non-discrimination is part of the fundamental principles and rights at work. It's of course very often interpreted as a gender issue, but it's also equal pay for work of equal value is also in the constitution of the ILO. And so I think by being a member of the ILO, in a way you accept these principles, but forcing governments is something that that is always really a tricky one, and that there is no world government that can force nation states to do things. So I think we are trying to show the good practices. We're trying to highlight facts and figures. It's also something we do in the Global Wage Report. We want to show where there are problems that exist, and we want to put data on the table, and we want to generate a debate, which ultimately also is a national debate with trade unions in those countries that have their responsibility, with civil society that have their responsibility, more than international organizations, really. But we're trying to contribute, of course, but ultimately it's very hard to force governments to do things. Can you remind me of any of the others I've forgotten?
Yes, so related to that, there was one of the factors actually contributing to lower wages have been also IMF conditionalities. So if you could comment a bit on that, and perhaps what is the ILO doing to that end?
Well, I think we've issued policy briefs. Now the ILO has been very active during this corona crisis in issuing policy briefs and sectoral briefs and a lot of documentations on our website. And I would encourage actually people who are listening to go to the ILO website and to click on the link to the COVID related documentation. And I think there we've been calling for fiscal and monetary policies that support not only jobs and incomes in the periods of the lockdown, but also post-lockdown, which is very important. I think that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past from switching immediately into austerity at the first signs of economic recovery. And I think I do think that there were clearly some mistakes, including by international organizations, that were made in the previous global financial and economic crisis. And so we are hoping to engage in the policy dialogue and promote fiscal monetary policies that will support a recovery in the short, but also in the medium term, because otherwise we really risk getting into very dramatic situations, because there is a lot of uncertainty of what comes next. Many governments have put in place programs and measures during the lockdown, which have saved people's incomes and jobs, and wage subsidies have been very important to maintain the employment relationship in many instances. But what is coming next? You know, many of these measures are temporary, and I think if we wind them down too quickly, the economic and social disaster is going to get worse in the near future. So I'm actually quite anxious about the developments in the next few months. Some people seem to think that the worst of the crisis is over. Yes, I mean there is there was urgency in putting in place emergency measures, but it is very important that we sustain people's livelihood through aggregate demand in the medium term. And I think the IMF here has a very important responsibility, and I hope that they will get things right. Of course, budget ceilings. There's always trade-offs. The budget is not unlimited, and we have to avoid wishful thinking also when we talk about the public sectors. The public sector expenditures are based on the taxes, and there might be loans, and there might be donors who might also contribute to increasing resources. But these resources must be managed in a responsible way, and there's trade-offs within the management of these resources. And what I'm also suggesting is that when we relook at public sector pay scales, we also look at some of the priorities that we have identified in public expenditures. And I think there is scope for raising the wages of people with low pay, in many instances, either by reducing inequality in the wages in the public sector, or by reallocating within existing resources. So yes, there is an issue of the fiscal space, but there is also an issue that within the existing fiscal space, how do we deal with these issues?
Another question for Mirai, if you could, it comes from Phoebe from was somewhere in Africa, she doesn't specify, but she said in Africa, most informal workers have no working contract, which makes them more vulnerable actually in terms of being fired. So the question is, I think it's not very clear, but in case assistance comes from the government, I suppose it's asking what would be the employer's conditions on such assistance coming from the government to address these issues of very vulnerable situation of informal workers.
Sorry, I didn't understand the point on employers.
Well, it says how will the employer come in should the financial assistance come from the government. So I suppose it means whether the assistance should be done with some conditionalities on the side of the government on the employers that are employing workers without contracts. So that.
Thank you for that. Well, as in Africa, so also in India, I mean, informal workers don't have contracts. They have shifting employment relations. So today I work for you, tomorrow I work for someone else. So that's the first comment I wanted to make. And if I understood the question properly, I think those who are informal workers, they hardly have an employer with whom they have a regular relationship. And very often employers, when they are asked by the Labor Department, do you know X, Y, or Z informal worker, they say, we've never seen that person before. Maybe they're right, maybe because there's a system of contractors, or because they don't want to follow labor laws, or they don't keep records deliberately of informal workers. So going through employers, I think, is not where it's at. I mean, our government has been talking to employers and telling them they should not cut people's wages and getting their help also in terms of relief packages and identifying workers. But for the most part, it will have to be through unions, through cooperatives, through various collectives at the grassroots level that governments will have to interface. Because it's these organizations, it's organizations, as I mentioned, like mine, who every day are working with the workers and enjoy their trust. And so we can help to bridge that gap between the government and the relief measures, the livelihood restoration measures, and the informal workers.
Thank you. And the two questions for Patrick. One is about wage subsidies, which have been part of the support coming from the government during the times of pandemic. So the questions are, can wage subsidies be part of a country's economic recovery stimulus package? And in what way can wage subsidies be a way to stimulate an economy battered by lockdowns due to the pandemics? And just related to that, another question from Laura, is it preferable to have wage subsidies through employers or directly to workers?
Thank you to participants for these questions. Yes, wage subsidies have been very, very important during the lockdowns in order to maintain the employment relationship. And I think those countries, and there are many of them who put them in place, were much more successful in limiting the increase in unemployment or the number of dismissals during the crisis. We've seen that most European governments have put wage subsidies in place, but there were also some lower income countries which have put them into action, including in Thailand, in Botswana, in Bangladesh, and I believe also in India, I'm not sure, in Brazil also, in Argentina, and of course initially they ensured that during the period of lockdowns, people wouldn't lose their jobs, and employers, enterprises could keep those people on the payroll and don't lose all their workers, because for enterprises it's also very bad to having to dismiss workers and to recruit new people afterwards. They have to retrain them. They're losing a lot of the enterprise-specific skills that people have acquired. And so these measures, which consisted in compensating people for up to 70% of their wages, or perhaps a bit less or a bit more, they are expensive, but on the other hand, you make savings in terms of avoiding having to pay unemployment benefits for them, for example. And in fact, there are strong economic benefits in putting them in place. I think a lot of governments understood this, and so they put them in place during lockdowns. Now the question is, can they be part of the measures to sustain a recovery? And I would think that the answer here is yes, because what happens now, if you're going to stop with these measures, is that enterprises are going to face a lower demand, that there are fewer customers in restaurants, in hotels. The tourism sector is declining. And so what are hotels and restaurants and enterprises going to do now after the lockdown? If they lose their customers, they're still going to dismiss the workforce, and we're going to go into a negative spiral of people losing their incomes and reducing their consumption, and will end up with very severe recessions. So I realize that these measures are expensive, but I think they should be extended. They should be extended, and they can be adjusted at the margin. They can be made a bit cheaper over time as well in different ways, but they need to be sustained in the next few months in order to avoid the economic catastrophe. So I definitely believe that they should be part of the answer. Of course, I also realize that that many people, that informality is a reality for 61% of the working population in the world, and that these people may not cannot be reached through wage subsidies. But in fact, wage subsidies can also be used to formalize people. And in fact, there are some countries which have given enterprises some extra time to register workers who were not registered before. Enterprises could register them in order to access the wage subsidies. And in fact, it's been done in Tunisia, for example, I believe, and in a number of other countries. And so in that sense, it's been used to formalize some people. Of course, it's not going to solve the problem for the 2 billion people in the world who work in informality. And so clearly wage subsidies are only part of the solution, but for those countries where most people are wage earners, they are very important. And even for the other countries, wage earners in the textile and garment sector or domestic workers have an employer. These are people who actually also very who can be actually protected through wage subsidies. So now the question is it better to pay workers or employers? I think most of the time they are being paid to enterprises, and in a way that's that's the way it should be, I think, because at least when it works well, the employer receives the subsidies and pays the worker, and the employment that's how the employment relationship normally works. Otherwise, paying the worker starts to look more like a social security or social protection measure, but it's perhaps the better solution when the controls are too difficult. Because of course, what you want to avoid is a situation of abuse where enterprises receive the subsidy but don't pass it on to the workers, and so I think these are circumstances where it might be safer to pay workers directly.
I don't know whether we have time for just one more question for each of you. So one to Mirai, actually. Lian from the Philippines is asking whether on a practical level, what do you actually tell while you're negotiating for informal workers, social protection and all the other measures, what do you actually tell to workers, to your own members during these times of very difficult circumstances under which they don't even have a job anymore? And perhaps I can use the time to put the question to you, Patrick, and then you can respond after Mirai. There is a group of questions coming about the situation of workers in the global supply chains and the particular situation in which they find themselves as the brands have cancelled orders. So it seems quite a few participants are concerned with that, and there is a direct question is, why don't we see the ILO with clear and stronger positions, asking different consortiums of brands and buyers to act responsibly and accountably in supporting governments of their resourcing countries?
So thank you to the sister from the Philippines. First of all, the kinds of demands that we are making of our government now, it's nothing new. These are long-standing demands of informal workers, their unions and cooperatives in India. So our message to our sisters and brothers in the workers' movement, informal workers, is that this is a time when perhaps our government is willing to listen. So we need to organize stronger and harder and come together and unite and build our solidarity and increase our collective strength and our collective voice to make sure that the measures that we've been asking for decades and decades actually might come to fruition. So that's the first message, organize more and harder. And I must say the workers have been extremely creative. We can no longer have area meetings and go house to house, but they've adapted to digital tools like WhatsApp and voice messages and so on. The second thing is that when the pandemic and the lockdown happened, immediately we responded as an organization with relief measures. So, you know, this not only in our experience with disaster after disaster, not only is it a required support at the time, but also it builds trust in organizing and in people's own organizations. Because they feel, again and again, we've been hearing this throughout the pandemic, they feel that they have not been abandoned, they have not been forgotten. Our governments may have forgotten us, but our own organizations have not forgotten us. And that only increases the trust and gives a boost to organizing, which then helps us further these demands. So I think those are the kinds of things that, on the positive side, so to speak, of the crisis we are in, that it has brought workers together, it has strengthened their demands and their resolve to move forward together because they understand that that's the only way.
Very shortly on the question of the textile and garment, I do believe that the ILO has been very vocal and present in this discussion and in trying to broker solutions in order to ensure that people in producing countries who actually saw that the orders were cancelled and that the payments weren't made in the beginning, that these people would actually be paid and compensated, and also to bring together the brands and the producers. Might not been as successful as you may have wished, I don't know. But here again, you can check the ILO webpage. There's a lot of information on what the ILO has done, and the program Better Work, which has also been very actively engaged in finding solutions. And we've also been working in a number of countries on wage subsidies in the textile and garment industry, including in Myanmar and in Ethiopia, where the ILO has actually really put in place the infrastructure to put in place wage subsidies for these people who would have otherwise lost all their incomes. So I think it's 4 o'clock, so I'm stopping there and back to the chairs.
So I would like to thank you very much for your time. It was really extremely helpful, and I really hope we can do this some other time again, as we are receiving more requests about organizing such activities. So thank you very much again.